Today's seminar is focused very much on the history of Freemasonry and its origins, and why I think we can now prove historically that this all began in Scotland. Up till this point in time, most people will believe that Freemasonry began in London in 1717 with the founding of the Grand Lodge of England. I'm going to show you how incorrect that is, okay? And I can get away with that because I don't think there are any English people here, so there should be no trouble that way. So I'm not a fan, I have to say, of PowerPoint because sometimes it can be a distraction. So this is a lecture, if you like, which I have illustrated with some pictures. So it's probably not an ordinary PowerPoint presentation, but it's my version, if you like. So what I'm going to concentrate on at first is this very important point that most people simply don't understand, and that is that Scotland produced lodges of stonemasons many years before lodges of Freemasons existed. And it is essential, I think, for the understanding of modern Freemasonry to understand the connection to stonemasonry and see what happened from stonemasons to Freemasons, and we can then begin to build a picture of the development of what happened from stonemasons lodges until the present day. Now, this presentation was designed with one country in particular in mind, and that was the United States, because I had found very good evidence to help explain that process. So although we're here in Sweden, we're going to talk a little bit about the United States, but we'll talk about Sweden later, because when Henrik arranged this seminar, I started to look at this side of the world, and I discovered it's as interesting as the other side of the world. But of course, it takes time to do the research. So we're going to have a look first at what we're looking at in terms of North America, not just the United States, but North America. Before 1710, this is before the Grand Lodge of England was founded, this is the picture in Scotland. And you will see there are approximately 12, at least 12 lodges from as far north as Inverness, up here, Kilmollymock, Banff, and then all down the coast. And then in the, what we call the central belt, a very large number of lodges. So Dundee, a very famous place, St Andrews, where the university is, Aitchison's Haven, Linlithgow, Stirling, etc., etc. So these are lodges which were already in recorded existence. That is, there are written records about these lodges before the existence of any Grand Lodge. Okay? So it's important to remember that in this country, which is quite separate from England, there is already a national system of lodges. Now, trying to work out how this national system worked without a Grand Lodge, because a Grand Lodge is a head office, it's a central controlling body. These are all separate lodges, independent of each other, with no head office. So how did this work? How did it operate? Who were the members? And that's the kind of thing that we're going to discuss. First and foremost, it's important to remember that most of these lodges were all initially stonemasons' lodges, but they later admitted and started to admit people like you and I into a stonemasons' lodge. So you were joining an existing organization. It was not new. It was not invented. You were joining something that had existed from a Scottish point of view for at least, at this stage, for at least 300 years. And one example, a very nice example, is most people focus, I have to say, on the oldest lodges, which are the oldest lodge in the world is Aitchison's Haven. Their minutes begin in January 1599. The second oldest is the Lodge of Edinburgh, which is in here somewhere, whose minutes begin in July 1599. But there are also other lodges which are interesting. And just because I know some of you will have read a lot about Edinburgh and Kilwinning, I'm going to talk a little bit about a different lodge. I'm going to talk about the Lodge of Aberdeen and this lodge down here called Melrose. Okay? And again, remember, we're talking about essentially an American experience. So this is the minute book of the Lodge of Aberdeen. And the interesting thing about this is, as you can see, it is extremely elaborate, handwritten, and it contains these pages, just these few pages, contain a lot of extremely important information. Now, the date, if it's on this page, I'll find it. Here, number 11, James Anderson, glazier and mason and writer of this book. So James Anderson himself lists himself as number 11. He's not a stonemason. He makes glass and puts windows into buildings. And he says that he is a mason, meaning a Freemason, and that's why he says a glazier and mason. So he says, I work as a glazier, but I'm in this lodge as a mason, as a Freemason. And he says, and I wrote this book. Then he adds, in very small writing, the date, 1670. So, more than almost 50 years before the Grand Lodge of England, this man, James Anderson, is writing the minute book of his lodge. What is very important about this man is that this is the father of the James Anderson who wrote the constitutions of the Grand Lodge of England in 1723. Okay? So, the James Anderson of 1723 was brought up in a Masonic family in Aberdeen, whose father was not only the secretary of this lodge, but he also serves, according to the minutes, he is also master of this lodge several times. So James Anderson, who is a Scotsman, who writes the constitutions for the Grand Lodge of England, comes from a Masonic family in Aberdeen. And so the effect of that has some impact on how he shapes the constitutions of the Grand Lodge of England, the first rules of Freemasonry. And we'll maybe find time to talk about that later. What is important is that this, as I said before, these lodges were all supposed to be lodges of stonemasons. But as they admitted people like me, so I became a member, and then I thought, well, I'll introduce my friend Henrik here, or my friend Bo, or Richard, or whoever. And so eventually, we end up with a lodge that, although it began as a stonemason's lodge, ends up with more people who are not stonemasons. And you can see that very clearly from here. So here you have the Earl of Findlater. So he's a very senior aristocrat. And he's a member of this lodge. He's number 13. Then you have Lord Pitsligo, another senior member of the Scottish aristocracy. Then you have a minister of religion, minister of Slains, this William Fraser. You have George Liddell, professor of mathematics in the lodge. And then you have ordinary other people, so-called ordinary people like an advocate, which is a senior lawyer. What is more, as you can see, from Edinburgh. So he has come from Edinburgh to join this lodge in Aberdeen. So, and that's a long journey at that time. Now, so clearly we have a stonemason's lodge, but it's full of people who are not stonemasons. And the question has always been, well, why? Well, we'll come to that later. I want to now mention one man in particular because he's very important in terms of how Freemasonry develops from this kind of lodge, which is mixed, counting the names, who you see where he's, this man, John Cadell, he just describes himself as a mason. So he is a stonemason, but also a Freemason. And this is the point that I'm going to make, that in Scotland, being a stonemason was also being a Freemason. The two were together. You could not separate them. If you were a stonemason, you were also a Freemason, as we know it today. And that's why all he can describe himself is as a mason, because he was a stonemason and a Freemason. The man who's, for this presentation, most important is this chap here, where I find him here, 27, John Skene, merchant and mason. So he describes himself, his job, his work is as a merchant, as a trader, but he is a mason, a Freemason. And he is most important because he is the first, sorry, we'll skip on to the Melrose connection. So that was the Aberdeen Lodge, a mixture of stonemasons and Freemasons. When we go to the Melrose Lodge, which is in the far south of Scotland, and very close to Melrose Abbey, which is one of the most beautiful abbeys, which is a ruin, unfortunately, but one of the most beautiful abbeys in the borders of Scotland. This lodge had nothing but stonemasons as members, at the same time as the Aberdeen Lodge has earls and lords and ministers and professors. This lodge has no one like that. They are only stonemasons. So here you have almost like two kinds of lodges at the same time. One that is mixed. The Aberdeen Lodge only had about 20% of stonemasons. This lodge in Melrose is 100% stonemasons. So what happens is very interesting, because John Skene, a merchant, he is a Quaker. And as you know, perhaps, the Quakers cannot, by their religion, cannot take an oath. But here you have this man, John Skene, merchant, who has taken an oath as a Freemason. He goes to New Jersey and Pennsylvania in early 1680, 1681, and he is the first known Freemason to be in North America, and that is why he is very, very important. But what becomes even more interesting is that he's from this lodge in Aberdeen, which you would call almost a modern Masonic lodge. When he gets to New Jersey, he meets a stonemason from the lodge in Melrose by the name of John Coburn, right? And they he comes back to Scotland, or he writes, John Coburn writes to his family in Melrose saying to all the stonemasons of Melrose, you should come to America because the opportunities for building stone buildings, stone houses, is enormous. But more importantly, what happens is that John Skene, the merchant, the man with money, meets John Coburn, the stonemason, and they decide to go into business together to build stone houses in America. So you have two kinds of masons going across the Atlantic and meeting together and building stone houses, so both in terms of practical actual working stonemasons, but also as thinking Freemasons, intellectual, esoteric Freemasons, they are also building houses in North America, in particular in this part of the world. And what's more, they actually name the places that in America after where they came from. So you can find here's the Aberdeen Township. This was land owned by Skene from Aberdeen, so he calls this little area Aberdeen. Perth Amboy used to be called Melrose, and there's all sorts of, and Highland Park, which of course, as we all know, is one of the nicest whiskies you can buy, but Highland Park, and so this is an area of concentration of stonemasons and Freemasons in North America, and they are building houses for people who previously lived in log cabins. I've been here, and unfortunately I can't find any actual buildings in this part, but this is Staten Island, and there are buildings from the very late 17th century that I think were built by Skene and Coburn as a business, and they're built in a very Dutch style of building, which was very well known also in Scotland. So here we have the situation where in North America, Freemasonry and stonemasonry has got together, but in Britain, we have a change from independent lodges to the founding of Grand Lodges. And we call these the home Grand Lodges. So the United Grand Lodge, or it's actually called, that word united shouldn't be there, because that didn't happen until 1813. 200 years ago. But anyway, the Grand Lodge of England is the first Grand Lodge in the world, 1717, followed by the Grand Lodge of Ireland in 1725, and then the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736. So the question is, why is it that a country that has a network, a national network of lodges, is the last one to have a Grand Lodge? Well, the answer may be something to do with the mentality of the Scots, of not wanting to have anyone in charge. They want to be their own people. What happened was, this is a copy of the letter. Those that decided they wanted a Grand Lodge of Scotland wrote a letter to every lodge in Scotland. And they were amazed to discover there were over 100 lodges in 1736, more than 100 lodges. And we know this because we still have the receipt for printing the letter. And we keep all the financial documents we still keep. And the printer charged us, I can't remember how much, for printing all these letters to go to all these lodges. So we had the inaugural meeting on the 30th of November 1736, which is St. Andrew's Day. And therein lies yet another story. What we have to then think about is the problems that these different lodges cause the Grand Lodge of Scotland. We have three types. We have the Aberdeen kind, which is a stonemason's lodge but has many Freemasons in it. We have the lodges like Melrose, which is only stonemasons. And then we have one or two lodges where there are no stonemasons at all. They are entirely speculative lodges. And the most famous one is the Hawkfoot Lodge, founded in 1702, with no stonemasons as members. So we have every conceivable kind of lodge in Scotland round in the early part of the 18th century, and that is entirely operative working stonemasons lodges. We have mixed lodges of stonemasons and Freemasons, and we also have purely Freemasons lodges. And this is the situation that confronts this new organization called the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And this causes a big problem because of the number of lodges who wanted to support the Grand Lodge, only 21 of the 100 lodges said the Grand Lodge of Scotland was a good idea. So in other words, the Grand Lodge of Scotland was not considered to be a very worthwhile thing. It was very shaky when it began, and it has consequences in our kind of Freemasonry to this day. However, William St. Clair of Roslin, and of course this again is part of the mythology, and we may talk about Roslin Chapel, etc. William St. Clair of Roslin becomes the first Grand Master. The fact that there was supposed to be an election, a democratic election, never took place. He was how would you say, the people were conned into adopting him as the Grand Master for a variety of reasons. I'll explain that later. So, why this vote of no confidence in the Grand Lodge of Scotland? Why are these lodges not interested? Well, there's simply a variety of them, a variety of reasons. They were independent, they'd never had a Grand Lodge before, so why did they need one now? And even the speculative lodges with no stonemasons, they had never had a Grand Lodge. So even they didn't see the need for a Grand Lodge. And eventually what happened was the Grand Lodge of Scotland had this enormous problem of trying to bring all these different kinds of lodges into the Grand Lodge system. And it wasn't successful initially, because what happened was, just to make things more difficult, we end up with 4 types of masonry in Scotland at the same time. And they're all running in parallel, if you like. So you've got the entirely operative, the entirely speculative, and they're both under the Grand Lodge of Scotland. Then you have the independent operative lodges and the independent speculative lodges. So things are very, very complicated at this point in time. We're talking about Scotland, and if you bear one thing in mind whenever you're thinking about Freemasonry, if you just realize that the whole world is out of step with Scotland, then you can understand why we have so many different problems and differences in Scotland. What happened was Kilwinning, Mother Kilwinning, number 0, decided that they were not happy with their position on the roll given to them by the Grand Lodge of Scotland. The Grand Lodge of Scotland had made them number 1 or 2, something like that. And they said, but we are the oldest lodge in Scotland. And the Grand Lodge refused to accept that and said, no, your earliest records begin in 1642, whereas the Lodge of Aitchison's Haven begin in 1599. The one in Edinburgh begins also in 1599, so you are number 2 or number 3 on the roll of lodges. So Mother Kilwinning said, this is nonsense, we're leaving. So they became independent. They became an independent lodge, and so we have a 5th type of Freemasonry in Scotland. We now have 5 systems. There were 4 that I previously mentioned, and now we have Mother Kilwinning, who become essentially a Grand Lodge, because they issue charters to other lodges. And some of them were also in the United States, but Ireland and England, and even some in Europe. So this very complicated situation meant that by 1743, before the Kilwinning issue, we had 3 types of masonry, and then the competition, and we were all competing for the same candidates, the same people. So operative lodges were seeking speculative masons, and speculative lodges were seeking operative masons, and the whole thing was extremely confusing. So we don't want to make this a huge, long story, and so we're going to skip minor things like the Jacobite Rising and all the rest of it, and turn back to America, because this is where we can show this very important link between the stonemasons lodges and modern Masonic lodges. George Washington was initiated in 1752, and he was initiated in a lodge in Fredericksburg, which was a Scottish lodge. Okay? Now, we have to explain that a little bit, because in 1752, the lodge in Fredericksburg had no charter or warrant or no authority from a Grand Lodge. So today he would be considered to be irregular or clandestine. But we know when we look at the records of the members of this lodge in 1752, they are all Scotsmen. Yeah? So it's a Scottish lodge. And I know from my own experience, even today, 250 years later, I can understand what they are thinking in 1752. They are saying, if we get a charter, it's going to cost 5 guineas. And that's quite a lot of money. And if the lodge doesn't work, if the lodge fails, we've wasted 5 guineas. So maybe we should have a lodge here, and if it works, then we'll get a charter from somewhere. And so they waited 6 years, and then they said, okay, it's working, we'll get a charter. And so they got a charter from the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1758. And so in many ways we can claim George Washington to be a Scottish Freemason. And here is just an example of the membership roll, and we're very proud of the fact that we have records going back, as I say, to 1599, but here you say this is at the quarterly communication of the 14th of August 1758, and the names of the people present, and it says somewhere here the granting of the charter of the lodge at Fredericksburg. So proof that the lodge was established by the Grand Lodge of Scotland. So why, back to Scotland, why is it such confusion? Well, essentially what's happening is we're imposing a completely new system of running lodges on an old existing stonemasons system. And that caused the problems of the Grand Lodge not being able to adopt all the lodges into the system. So there is another esoteric, and I have to be careful here. Yes, we'll skip that. What happened was that there was a new ceremony introduced later in the 18th century, which gave the operative Masons a much higher status than they had before. And that status meant that they could now accept the Grand Lodge of Scotland system, and they joined in very large numbers. And so this, again, I'm dodging this because I'm aware that there are some people who have not got all the degrees. But the essential fact is that, again, this ceremony, called the Mark ceremony, made the direct connection between stonemasonry and Freemasonry. And to illustrate that fact, I'm going to skip back again, to the United States of America. The United States became independent in 1776, partly because what was happening was that the British Army would recruit lots of Scots people and send them to America to fight the rebels. But the Scots realized that they were getting a free fare, a free passage to America, to a new country, and so they would join the army, sail to America, and then join the rebels. So, and who would give them land? So it was too attractive a proposition not to do that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, America wins its independence. It needs to build a capital city. Now, America at that time, North America, is covered with forests, and so the natural building material is wood. You know, so that's why you see the log cabins in the old Western movies from Hollywood. But you can't build a capital city out of wood. You need to build it out of stone. And so George Washington, the Scottish Freemason, asks the question, where do we get the best stonemasons to build the new capital of the United States of America? And he is told by the Americans, or he may have told the American Civil Service, or the American Civil Service find out, but whatever happens is we simply know from the records that they are told the best stonemasons come from Scotland. So if you want to build a new city from scratch, from stone, you need to get stonemasons from Scotland. And so this was exactly what happened. An individual who was in America by the name of James Triquear was a member of the Lodge of Journeyman Masons, and you'll see the significance of the name of the lodge. It was an operative lodge, and what is more, it was specifically for journeyman masons, that is, traveling masons. And so the letter from James Triquear, who was a member of this lodge, still exists, and it's in the lodge records. James Triquear writes from America to the lodge in Edinburgh, would you like to come to America and help us build this new capital city? It's very interesting, he did not write to the Grand Lodge of Scotland. He wrote to the lodge, directly to the lodge, asking if anybody would emigrate to America. And so we know that at least 6, but probably many more, actually emigrated, and they are recorded. There was also what we would call the overseer, the foreman, the head stonemason was a man called Colin Williamson, who was a member of the Lodge of Dyke, which is in the far north of Scotland. So he was gathering stonemasons from all over, not just number 8. And just to prove it, this is an extract from the treasurer's account book. And what they did in those days, you can see it's ruled off, and every 3 months you had to pay a certain amount of money. But this is, I'm showing you this just to show that James Triquear is a member of this lodge. You can see the date, 1792. Of course, this is just very shortly after the Washington, D.C. had been begun to be built. But you'll notice the treasurer, the Scottish treasurer, has marked him as being in America. But he hasn't deleted him from the lodge records, and he keeps a record of all the payments that he didn't make to the lodge, because he might come back one day, and then he would know how much he was due to pay the lodge. And the same happens again. You see James Triquear here, and he goes on, year by year, and he's counting every missed payment by James Triquear. So, in Scotland at this time, the stonemasons of Scotland were considered to be the creme de la creme of people who built things. They were very precise, and they built buildings that were designed to last hundreds of years. So they were very meticulous, very careful, and produced very high quality work. The problem was that they were somewhat slow in that sense, because producing high quality work was slow. But the fact is, they were recognized as being the best, and the American Civil Service decided, we want you, Scottish stonemasons, to build a house for the President, George Washington. So here we have this very curious situation of the President of the United States of America wanting a house built by Scottish Freemasons from Scotland. So 2 lodges, one in America and one in Scotland, coming together to build a house for George Washington, a Scottish Freemason. And no doubt they were honoured by that fact. It would be a very prestigious building project. And the reason why they wanted to build a house for the president in Washington, D.C., was simply because George Washington was living in Mount Vernon, which still exists. This is his house in Mount Vernon, which is south of Washington, D.C., and he was having to commute from Mount Vernon to Washington, D.C. to run the country, to run the government. And it was unseemly to have a president riding a horse in bad weather, and that's why they wanted a house so that he could stay in the city whenever he was needed without having to go home every night to Mount Vernon. So whether or not they knew that they were building a house for a fellow Freemason who happened to be the president, we don't know. We do know that George Washington attended a number of lodge meetings, and particularly in the military lodges. There were lots of military lodges. Unfortunately, he died a few months before the building was finished. And what happened was the building, when it was complete, was then used by the next president, whose name, yes, I can't recall the name. But what happened was thereafter, and we're going to skip a few years, there was a war between America and Britain. Now, the Americans called it free enterprise. We called it gun running. They were selling guns to Napoleon, of course, and we were at war with Napoleon at the time. And so to try and stop them selling guns to Napoleon, we, the British, invaded the United States of America from Canada and attacked Washington, D.C. And the house that the men from Edinburgh, the stonemason Freemasons from Edinburgh had built, sorry, that's it there, nearly the whole city was destroyed by fire. And this was in 1812. And the Americans don't talk about this war very often because they lost. But anyway, they didn't send any more guns to Napoleon. When peace was declared, there was a big problem. They had the city which had been burnt down. But the president's house, because it had been so well built by the stonemason Freemasons, because it was so well built, all that had happened to it was the roof, the wooden roof, had burnt and fallen into the interior of the building. And all they needed to do was clean the inside of the building and put a new roof on top. And in order to disguise all the smoke and the soot damage from the fire, was that they whitewashed it and called it the White House. So when you see President Obama standing on the White House lawn giving some speech of world importance, the building behind him was built by Freemasons, stonemasons from Scotland. Thank you very much.